Welcome to Regulate This, a really unfiltered podcast.
I am your host, Leila Shaver, and I'm here with my co-host, Tracie Behr. Tracie, say hey.
Hello! We are so excited today to bring you some more content that you'll be able to use to ensure that you're meeting your compliance needs. And if you aren't, at least start on the road to recovery. So today, we are going to be going over Reg BI versus Fiduciary. The ultimate showdown. Da da da.
Burr, burr, burr. All right, so I think we really need to start with some basics, right? So when we're talking about fiduciary, what are we talking about? When we're talking about Reg BI, what are we talking about? So fiduciary, we're talking about generally the fiduciary standard, meaning that as a financial advisor and an investment advisor firm. So we're talking about an RA, a registered investment advisory firm. We're not talking about brokers. We're not talking about broker dealers. We're talking about RIAs, and you as an IR, you have a fiduciary standard. You must do what's in the best interest of the client, meaning you even have to put the client's best interests ahead of your own. And that's where you're required to disclose conflicts of interest, other sources of compensation. You're supposed to be discussing any kind of activity you conduct where you have interests that may be in conflict with your client's interests. So that is the fiduciary standard. When we're talking about Reg BI, we're talking about regulation best interest, also known as the best interest standard. And this establishes a standard of conduct for broker-dealers and any associated persons when making recommendations to retail customers. And then there is the DOL fiduciary rule, which, is very similar to regulation best interest. And sets up those standards in relation to retirement planning and retirement accounts that fall under ERISA. So a big mouthful there in terms of all the different things we're talking about.
So why are there differences or nuances? Why couldn't they just have one straight standard? Is there something that they need to watch for to make sure that they're doing the right things?
So part of the reason is, in the FINRA broker-dealer world, the brokers don't really have a fiduciary standard. They just have to make sure that the recommendations they're making are suitable for the client. This means that given the client's investment objectives, risk tolerance, time horizon, investment objectives, age, liquidity needs, etc., that the recommendation being made is suitable. So one of the examples I like to give is you have a multimillionaire who's 95 years old, right? Lucky to be alive, knocking on death's door. And we put this person into an oil and gas deal, an alternative investment. Now, given that client's investment profile, it may be suitable, right? They meet the accredited investor status, they want to grow their money, they're willing to take a little bit of risk because at this point in their life they don't need the money to sustain their retirement. So maybe it's suitable, but then the question when we talk about the fiduciary rule or Reg BI or the DOL's fiduciary standard is it in their best interest? Is this a decision that a prudent person would make? And that's where that divergence of standards happens. Because this likely would not have been in the best interest of that client to put them in this alternative investment, but on the broker-dealer side, that may have been suitable. So the goal is to try to standardize the standards by which people who make investment recommendations have to abide by. And it's basically trying to fix this discrepancy between the broker-dealer and investment advisory worlds.
So how often do you see like a rub happening between those two worlds where you might have to intervene either as a CCO for some firms or as an attorney where you're doing general counsel.
So, the criticism that's been received regarding Reg BI and the fiduciary standards through the Department of Labor's rule is that it's created some inconsistencies, it's created some conflicts in the language, and it's made it difficult for financial advisors and brokers to adequately comply, especially where you're a duly registered person, right? So where you're both a broker and an investment advisor. Are you being clear with yourself and the client under which hat you are wearing when you make a particular recommendation? And therefore, what standard are you complying with? And then, to add additional wrinkles of complexity, the fiduciary standard under the Department of Labor's rule is in relation specifically to retirement planning and specific types of retirement accounts, whereas Reg BI is more of a general standard put on brokers. So that's where there's been a lot of back and forth. There's been lawsuits. There's been amendments to the rules. There's been guidance. There's been some enforcement actions. And all of these things are supposed to bring clarity, and if nothing else, they've brought additional confusion. I think a lot of compliance consultants, they really don't have a really good grasp or understanding of how these different regulatory schemes work together. So oftentimes we get firms reaching out to us as a law firm looking for that legal guidance on what does apply and what doesn't. How do I practically implement these rules in my business?
What happens if they don't comply?
Well, worst case scenario is you get fined, you get suspended, you get barred. Those are kind of the disciplinary actions that can be taken against an individual advisor, against a firm. Is there was a violation of the rules, there may have been some sort of client harm, and as a result, you receive a suspension or a bar as an individual. You could potentially also face a bar as a firm, and then you could also individually and as a firm be fined. Potentially have to pay disgorgement. So disgorgement relates to returning fees that were paid to you for the services provided. So it's very possible if there was any sort of client harm, or if you weren't following the standards or rules, that you would be required to return fees to clients as well.
Well, like Jessica Rabbit from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I'm not bad. I was just drawn that way. So if I'm not trying to be a bad actor, but after hearing all of the wisdom you're imparting on us, I find that maybe I fall into the category where I need some improvement. What are some next steps I could take to get myself into the right path to ensure that I'm, following the rules and not putting myself or my clients or the firm in harm's way?
I mean, listen, we talk about it over and over and over again, and that is, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So if you identify certain deficiencies in your compliance, your supervision, in complying with these rules and regulations, you've got to do something, right? So the big things that we know that everyone's familiar with that came out of these different regulatory schemes, we have Form CRS, which is that pesky 2-page templated document that we have to put together. And then the DUL rollover forms that many of our financial advisors are having to complete that documents the basis for recommendation from one type of retirement account to another, and asterisk of retirement accounts as covered under ERISA and the DOL. So, those are the practical implementations that have happened. In terms of potential areas of deficiency, maybe you're not getting those rollover recommendations documented appropriately. Maybe the basis for the recommendation is not adequately articulated. You haven't done appropriate due diligence on the former account plan versus the new account plan. When it comes to Reg BI, maybe you haven't provided the appropriate information to the clients. They understand the transaction that you're recommending. I mean, there's a lot of things that you could be doing, and at the end of the day, how do you comply? You create testing, you create oversight, you do training and education, you trust but verify, so reviewing these rollover recommendation forms, making sure they're completed adequately, implementing supervisory measures such as pre-approval for certain types of products, even putting in place heightened supervisory requirements for people over a certain age or for vulnerable adults, kind of an extra layer of making sure that a particular transaction complies with Reg BI where it applies, to make sure that something's not just suitable but also in the best interest of the client.
Good. So now we've let people know what this is, why it's important, what happens if you do nothing, what happens if you're not doing all of the right things but you want to be, how you can actually transition and get yourself back on track. Is there anything else that would be good for people to know or understand about this before, we sign off? Is there something else, another nugget or anything we can leave our listening audience? Because I know everybody that's listening to us wants to do the right things. They're just trying to learn and grow as they go. So anything we can give them will be a nugget of gold wisdom.
This conversation, ever since these rules were first even contemplated, these have been ongoing conversations with our team, with our clients. And it's because, again, as I alluded to at the beginning of this conversation, there's been confusion, there's been changes, there's been lawsuits, there's been back and forth. And sometimes it's hard to appropriately advise someone because the rule is constantly changing. For example, on the DOL's fiduciary rule, there are certain changes and updates to the prohibited transaction exemptions that have happened this year. There's another batch of changes that are supposed to go into effect in September of 2025, which makes it kind of an ever-evolving regulation and can sometimes make complying difficult. And a lot of times, as is the case with many regulations, you really don't know what the regulators want till after they start conducting examinations and looking at what firms are doing to comply with the rule and kind of determine what they do like and what they don't like. So it can be difficult. I think at the end of the day, get your complaints out, vent, do what you need to get out all your frustration regarding the rules, and then let's do something about it. Because ultimately, you have to, if you want to stay out of trouble, you have to be able to show regulators during your next exam, so whether that's a FINRA cycle exam or an SEC or state exam of your RIA, you've got to be able to show where you're reviewing this area of concern, you're looking at recommendations, you're looking at transactions that fall under the oversight of these regulations. You've got to identify that you've implemented the appropriate paperwork, so like those rollover forms, so that these financial advisors and brokers can appropriately document their recommendations. And there has to be some sort of oversight, right? So you're archiving, right? You're documenting the recommendation, but you've also got to have some sort of supervisory element as well. So if someone isn't adequately documenting the basis for the recommendation or not adequately documenting that they had this conversation with the client and the client understands the basis for the recommendation. These are all things that you won't know unless you're supervising and you have some sort of testing in place to catch those deficiencies. And then once you do, you've got to implement. And listen, the biggest complaint we hear about these rules is all the extra paperwork, all the extra documentation I have to put together, all the time I have to spend trying to find this old 401k plan and figure out what the fees were and what they were getting out of it, and then comparing it to the IRA benefits that I want to roll them over into. It's like, I get it, it's a pain in the ass, but unfortunately this is what you have to do to comply with the rules and regulations. So education, training, ongoing supervision are going to be the keys. You also want to be able to show a regulator when they come in all the things you've done to implement, train, fix, adjust, tweak, pivot, and continue to move forward as these rules and regulations evolve and change, and as the obligations of the individual and the firm evolve
Well, a few things that I heard you say that we say quite frequently on our podcast, but I think it's important to point out. You said this earlier. If you don't document it, it doesn't happen. That's a huge thing for people to remember. That's true in almost every relationship in business, but certainly true when you have auditors coming in, when you have people that are overseeing some of the things you're doing to make sure that you're complying with all of the regulatory standards and the guidance that's out there. It can't be a he said, she said, or she said, she said, or any other version of that. It has to be documented, or else it simply didn't happen. And the amount of time it takes to recreate documentation after the fact is so laborious and so expensive to do that it just doesn't make sense. Do it right, do it light, do it wrong, do it long. So, if you do it out of the gate, you have much better chance of properly documenting, not forgetting anything, no lapsed memories, all of those good things. The other thing that you mentioned is really just having that consistency and making sure that you understand that compliance isn't a one and done. It's ongoing. There are things that are going to be, there are definitely things that are going to be adjusted. There are things that are going to evolve. There are things that are going to be changed. And it isn't just based on whatever administration's in or whatever society says the flavor of the month is. It really is this ongoing thing. So if you are just doing what, we've talked about in past episodes of our podcast, where it's like I'm plugging in my spouse, I'm plugging in my sibling, I'm plugging in one of my children, I'm plugging in an administrative assistant that wears 75 other hats. I'm doing it myself as the owner, as I'm trying to wear all of these other hats and grow my business and engage new clients and get employees onboarded and expand into new markets. Is that person you have in there able to keep up? Are they able to understand the complexities? Are they able to follow new guidance, new regulations, evolution in guidance and regulations? I think those things are also important to impress upon our audience, because having the wrong person in that seat can cost you time, money, and your reputation, which means clients, both ones that are current and any potential future clients that might walk away. Can you speak to having somebody consistent in that role, or the bandwidth they need in order to be able to keep up and comply?
So, I think this is where, we're talking about recommendations from licensed people, right? Whether you're a licensed broker, Series 7 licensed, or whether you're an investment advisor, usually 65 licensed. You are someone who's in a position to give investment advice, right? And so these are the people that are having to document the basis for these recommendations. These are the people who are required to comply with these rules and regulations. So, that's why the training is so important for them, because they're ultimately the people making the recommendations. From a supervisory perspective, this is not the kind of task you give to a junior level compliance person to review these rollover forms, for example, or pre-approve certain types of transactions that are subject to these regulations. You want to give this to someone who's got a little bit more experience in the industry, who is looking more globally at a particular recommendation, not as a standalone recommendation, but as a greater part of a strategy, looking at the investment profile of the client. So, I think this is where a lot of training needs to be put in place. But I think this is where firms can also make decisions about, you can only make these types of recommendations or sell these types of products if you go through this education, and if you take this quiz, if you come to this ongoing education component that we have in the firm. Otherwise, you can't make these types of recommendations. I think you've got to do that ongoing training with your compliance and supervisory staff as well, so you know what to look out for, how to critically think about the documentation they're reviewing, and look at a client's profile to really make the determination that this is more than just a suitable investment advice. This is really in their best interest. So, and to your point, you need the right type of people for that.
Right. So it's kind of more than one layer. It's not just the CCO or the compliance department doing the testing that might stumble across something either in a document that they receive from an advisor or from an email that they might see something that's been recommended or requested. But it's also training those advisors directly to ensure that they understand the importance of the breadth of work that they're doing and the recommendations they're making, and what that can lead to if it's improper or not suitable, or let's just throw spaghetti at the wall and figure it out. Hopefully nobody has the advisors that are doing that in their firm, but you'd be surprised and astonished, really. But it definitely is several layers of people, because even those people that might be reviewing the documents or might be processing the documents, or maybe the compliance people that see things, they need to understand this as well. So it's multifaceted. How frequently do you usually recommend training or updating training for folks that are either making recommendations to clients or seeing the recommendations that are coming through on the compliance side?
Sure, and I think this is where you really need to customize the testing and supervision based on your firm, right? Looking at not only your internal and external resources that you have available that you can leverage to do these reviews, but how many advisors do you have? How many duly registered folks do you have? How many brokers do you have? How often are you making rollover recommendations, for example? How often do these need to be reviewed? For some firms, it doesn't happen very frequently, so maybe it's a review that you do quarterly. For some firms that are larger that do more of these types of recommendations, you're looking at weekly or even monthly reviews. I think there needs to be ongoing training. I always recommend at least quarterly training when it comes to compliance. And this should be one of the areas that's discussed on an ongoing basis. It should almost be like a permanent agenda item on those trainings, just to give updates on enforcement actions or rule guidance, or even updates to the rules themselves, which I mentioned earlier. There are several that have been implemented and will be implemented later this year. So I think that's super important. You want to document those trainings. You want to document who showed up to those trainings. You want to document any resources, and I would provide resources. Talking is not enough. I'm sure there's some people who heard at the beginning DOL best interest and were like, nope, turned it off, right? Or started hearing us talk about supervision archiving, they're like, nope, turning it off. It's not a sexy topic. It's not oftentimes a fun topic. It's a necessary topic to talk about. So put any resources you can put together, cheat sheets, best practices, things to look out for, anything kind of short and to the point that you can give people, to advisors, to compliance staff, to help guide them in these processes. I think those are all helpful, useful things, and it's also documented. So these are also things you can produce to your regulators to show the efforts you've undertaken as a firm to ensure your staff and your advisors are appropriately educated and know what the expectation is.
Oh my gosh, those are great pearls of wisdom, especially the little nugget that seems almost like a throwaway, which is document who was at the training. You don't know how many times from an HR perspective I'll hear people say, oh no, we've trained our staff. Well, you did, but new staff have arrived since then. You've had changes, you've had people leave, you've had people enter your workforce, you've had people that were maybe here but on vacation or sick. Do you have a requirement, or do you have something where they have to show that they completed the training that everybody else had? Also, if new hires start, or somebody maybe moves to a different role in the firm where maybe they weren't subject to the training before, but they are now, ensuring that you have some type of standard and some type of policy set up so that you know when those people are going to also receive the training. It's very important, because most of us, our memory is, oh yeah, we did that training, check. Not, oh yeah, we did that training with 5 people, but we have 25 on staff that need it. So that's also a great point. So I think, in this episode today, we've actually not only shown what Reg BI is and what the fiduciary duty is and what the DOL duties are that are out there, but also we've shown those standards, we've shown what it takes to kind of be in compliance. We've talked about what happens if, like I said, Jessica Rabbit, you're not bad, but you're just drawn that way. If that happened to you and you're trying to do the right things, but after listening and not ending early because it sounded stressful or like, oh gosh, something else, but instead you're taking notes, there are things that we've shared with you that you are able to implement, things that you are able to start doing, standards that you can have set in your firm, ways that you can document what you're doing so that you're able to show auditors that you're doing the right thing. So again, good compliance is good business. Any final words before we close out this session of our podcast, Regulate This?
I think the one thing to keep in mind is this rule isn't going anywhere. It's evolved, it's changed, but I think it's here to stay. So as much as there are some firms that are trying their best to minimize the impact of the kind of documentation side, it's not something that we're going to be able to get rid of. It's here to stay, in my opinion. It's just a matter of the evolution of the rule and guidance that comes out. So the sooner you act to implement changes, if you find that you're deficient, the faster you're going to minimize risk and liability in your firm. We've already seen multiple enforcement actions related to regulation best interest, to the Department of Labor's fiduciary rule. We're seeing states also implementing rules and regulations when it comes to people who are providing investment advice. So it's just a part of the change and evolution of our side of the industry. And I think it's, change is really difficult, and I think it gets harder with age, but it's happening. So the sooner that we comply and make sure we're implementing solutions to comply, the better. And ultimately, no one wants to spend the legal fees associated with fighting the regulators, defending yourself during an enforcement action. No one wants to pay multi-million or multi-six-figure fines. So just suck it up and do it. Sorry.
No, I think that's good advice, and ultimately, remember, if this is something that seems like it's a hurdle too high, if it's, not the highest and best use of your time, maybe as the owner, you want to get out there and you want to bring in business, or perhaps you want to get out there and acquire new business and new clients. And that might be a higher and better use at this point. If you're ready to outsource, there are a lot of providers. Of course, we're one, My RIA Lawyer, and you can find us at www.myrialawyer.com. But there are other outsource providers that are available, other consultants that are available to help you. Make sure you have somebody in place that's monitoring and that's looking. And ultimately, if you need additional guidance, you can always look to us for Compliance University to help train you and get a system put in place for your unique circumstances. Look to us for your guidance, but also come back. Come visit our podcast. We're going to have many more topics that will help you along your journey. You can visit us on YouTube and look at a lot of the videos and educational materials we have out there. LinkedIn, come look and sign up with Leila on LinkedIn so that you can get videos that she posts out there as well. You can also go onto our website and sign up for that newsletter that we put out each week. That gives you a lot of information and a lot of new things that are coming out for guidance and regulatory fines and disciplinary actions and things to watch for. Again, it's www.myrialawyer.com. And ultimately, look for us anywhere that you're getting your podcasts. It could be Spotify, it could be Apple, or anywhere else that you can find us. We'll be there sharing more details so that you're able to comply and keep your business running and humming along swimmingly. We look forward to sharing more information in the future, but until next time, remember, good compliance is good business.